Right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today. The topic of the webinar is meeting UK IRB and Research Ethics Committee expectations for patient review of research participant information. We have a host of wonderful speakers here today who are going to share their experiences, direct and also more generally in having patient involvement in the development of materials that are intended for research participants. I'm going to start off by giving brief introductions of each of our panelists. And as we move on to the next slide here, you can see that after that, we will have an overview of the newly put out sort of guidelines on having patient involvement in the development of these materials. And then we will have a nice panel discussion sharing insights and considerations towards how to do that work. And then we'll go into a Q&A and discussion. For the Q&A, we absolutely welcome attendees to share their questions. Those will be shared with me, and then I'll be happy to share them out to the panelists. So for introductions here, my name is Beitash Bahadur. I'm the Director of Health Literacy here at CISCRP. CISCRP is an independent nonprofit organization, and we work in patient engagement. Joining me on this webinar are Amanda Hensby and Becky Petch. They are Clinical Quality Associate Directors at AstraZeneca UK Limited. And we also have Dr. Sonia Abraham, who's the Senior Director of Global Clinical Development at CSL, and Ellen Getz, who's the Director of R&D Patient Partnerships, Strategic Operations at CSL. And first, we're going to start off by having Thomas Jorgensen, who is the Chief Operation Officer of James Lind Care. Thomas is going to give us an overview of the patient review aspects of the UK quality standards and design and review principles. So we'll pass it over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Beitash. And I'll try to take us through some slides here. I should say that I'm, as you mentioned, representing James Lind Care, which is a Danish-based patient recruitment company, representing around 250,000 patients, which we currently have in our patient communities across different countries in Europe. And in the process of guiding these patients to clinical trials, we engage with them quite a bit. In that sense, this topic is of interest to these patients and members we have. So it is also of interest to us, obviously. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start out by, I think, just running through some of the wording around these newly published quality standards and design and review principles. And I think we'll talk about, what they are and also a little bit about why they are, which is quite important. So the quality standards, they set out as it says here, the minimum criteria that all participant information or patient-facing information must meet. And then the design and review principles, they go a little more into depth in how to review the standards from the ethics committee's point of view, members of the ethics committees, and also a little bit more about how you can actually live up to the standards. What should you do? So let's dive a little into the wording just to make sure we're all on the same page. Next slide, please. All right, I won't go, completely down into every word here in the next couple of slides, but when you pass your submissions through the IRIS system in the UK, then there are certain things that you need to provide, show. You need to show when it comes to patient information, who was involved in this development of the participant information, how many people were involved, and how was this feedback that you received from the public actually used, and what did you change based on that feedback in, for example, it could be any really patient-facing information or material. Next slide, please. So if we jump into the design and review principles, I just need to move this so I can see the slides a little better. Just a second. Yes. So the wording here from the HRA is that you need to involve public contributors when you do this, and it needs to be relevant and understandable for the intended audience. I don't think that's a big surprise. It shouldn't be. That's what we've been striving to do all the time. You should also involve people with a relevant experience. That is often the case. Patients, could be family members. You need to make sure that the information that you provide is relevant and understandable. And down in the last point, you need to have public involvement that is meaningful, and that is really defined here as 4 key points that I think are really important to remember, and that is to involve the right people, involve enough people, and involve those people enough, and then also describe how it helps. And I think a big part of why we are here is to try to get a little closer to a common understanding of what this actually means. What is the right people and what is enough people, and so on. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little more about the design and review principles. One of the things that they write is that if people have been involved outside of the UK, so let's say in another country, you are running your sponsor based in another country, could be Spain or whatever, and then you have had, as long as you have gone through these principles and done that sufficiently, then you don't need to involve UK patients. And if you are a CRO or a sponsor that conducts a lot of very similar studies, could be, for example, as they say here, phase 1 clinical trials with healthy volunteers, then you could have some template participant information that you can reuse, that has been through this process of patient feedback and review. Okay. Yeah, and these templates they write here are informed by public involvement in different ways. So you can do surveys or other evaluation activities. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think these 2 points are quite important. Here it is quite clear that patient information developed without public involvement will not normally receive a favorable opinion from a research ethics committee in the UK. Then you could be asked to, if you don't meet these principles, you could be requested to further involve patients or the public before such a study is actually giving a favorable opinion. All right. So what we did was that here at James Lind Care, we thought, well, we have access to a lot of members or patients via our communities. So why not try and ask them what they think about participating in this? I mean, are they willing to provide input and feedback and so on patient-facing materials associated with clinical studies or clinical trials? And we went out and asked 1,000 patients, and actually 930 of them said yes when they were asked if they would be interested in providing feedback. That's, to me, a surprisingly high number. And 58% of them said that they would be very willing to provide feedback. This is very interesting because it shows, without a doubt that patients want to contribute to research, I think, and they want to be involved in patient-facing materials and clinical trials in general. Next slide, please. Yes. So we thought also, you know, how long will are these patients willing to spend on this? And 83% of them said that they were actually willing to spend at least 2 hours on something like this, which is also quite a lot of patients, right? Quite a large proportion. And then we thought, why not also ask them if they expect to be compensated in any way. And around half of them said that they actually didn't expect to receive any payment when we asked them about that. I'm not saying that they shouldn't get any payment, but that's also just showing, I think, the incentive and why these people want to contribute. It probably has absolutely nothing to do with money. So that is very, very interesting in numbers, I think. Next slide, please. Yes, and I think that was it from me at the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thomas. I think that's a very helpful overview, and also great to know, right, that that there are so many motivated individuals who want to be involved in this work. And just one point that we thought might be helpful to share from SysScript's 2023 Perception and Insights Survey is that the fourth highest ranked item in helping to improve trust in pharmaceutical companies is patients and the public knowing that a company is sharing information in patient-friendly language that can easily be understood. And actually, the third ranked item is knowing that a company actively works with patients and caregivers and patient communities to make clinical research studies easier to participate in. So, you know, both of those elements show sort of further value in addition to, of course, meeting these expectations of the research ethics committees and the NHS in the UK. So, and another point that we can advance to the next slide here as we wrap up the presentation part of our slides or of this webinar. But another point that we wanted to just sort of make sure that we touch on is that currently sort of the expectation is that this applies for all information that a participant may receive in a trial. Of course, participant information is sometimes looked at as purely the informed consent document. In this case, it does seem to be that any information that's being provided to a participant in a trial. So if there are study brochures that are provided as they're active participants, if there are engagement communications such as thank you cards or similar types of things, those also would fall under this requirement. Presumably also outcome assessments, questionnaires that are being used, diaries, interview guides, and also technology that participants may be asked to use, whether that's decentralized trial technology or otherwise. Presumably, all of those things would have some level of expectation that there has been patient involvement or patient review in ensuring that they are understandable and usable. Another point that I thought would be helpful to make, or just to make sure that we are reiterating if we have said it already, is that the quality standards and the review and design principles also have quite a bit of language regarding essentially the use of good health literacy practices, ensuring that documents are easy to understand. And we are just focusing today on the patient involvement aspect, which is also a matter of good health literacy practice. So with that, we can remove the slides from the presentation and go into our panel discussion. Currently, it looks like our colleagues from AstraZeneca, Becky and Amanda, are having trouble joining the webinar. So we're going to start off particularly going over to Ellen and also Dr. Abraham over at CSL, because they will help us all in this next discussion portion elucidate the point of involving the right people, involving enough people, and involving those people enough. So they're going to speak from their experiences and their approaches. So I will hand it over to them. You folks have the floor.
Thank you, Betosh, and thank you so much for having us today. So Sonia and I thought that we could start by just sharing a little bit more about our roles and what and also the way that we think about patient focus at CSL. So for my position, I'm working to gather input from patients, from care partners, study participants, healthcare providers, and researchers to help develop strategies and plans to support patient engagement and appreciation throughout the life cycle of our studies. So I was really pleased to hear, Thomas, in your presentation, just the continued focus on making sure that we're engaging with the right people at the right times, and not just in a transactional fashion, but in a way that's sustainable. And I think that's incredibly important. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I know that for Dr. Sonia Abraham and myself, increasing clinical trial education and accessibility is something we're both very passionate about. So we'll talk a little bit about how we try to incorporate these learnings into the way that we design our studies, and operationally as well. But Sonia, I'll turn it over to you for a brief intro, and then we can dive right in.
Great, thank you, Ellen. And again, thank you to the organisers for inviting us. So, I mean, I feel very privileged in my position. I'm a clinical development lead in a number of clinical trials. I've also had the privilege of meeting patients whilst working in the NHS, and also being part of HRA processes. And now it's become even more global, and everything, you know, that we do, be it serving our patients, be it organizing clinical research for benefit of therapeutics, our patients and their carers and their families have to be at the center of it. And whilst we're having these conversations and it's much more formalized how we involve them, it's something that we should just be doing implicitly. And to date, people have, but it's great that we can formalize it. And, you know, and a thank you for sharing the feedback on the survey to the patients and carers. Most people are altruistic. They really want to improve the outcomes from diseases of things that they've experienced, and it's really heartening to hear. So one of the things that certainly I was very keen to do when I was privileged to come and work with CSL and work with Ellen in particular is really ensure that we bring both patients and carers along the journey right from the conception of a clinical trial, involving them with how we develop our protocols, not just a touch base for the ICFs and the patient-facing materials, bringing them along with on the journey of why we're doing this, how we're doing this, is it appropriate what we're doing, and then evolving to those patient-facing materials.
Absolutely, and that really drives home the way that we recognize patients and carers as critical stakeholders to assess the feasibility and also the value of our investigational treatments. And we want them to feel like they are these critical stakeholders throughout development. So we're always trying to learn how best to partner with them and how to make our clinical trials less burdensome. We find that one of the most valuable ways is to run patient advisory boards. And as Sonia was saying, starting right at concept phase, perhaps for a phase 1 study, and being able to manage throughout the course of the asset life cycle. And then throughout that, in a more sustainable way, we're obtaining feedback on, like you were mentioning too, Beitash, adaptive clinical trial technologies or hybrid approaches. We're thinking about any kind of supplemental materials or new educational materials we can develop or co-develop with patients and care partners that can support informed consent conversations, that can help patients better understand management of a disease or of a condition. And then we're also looking at sharing, or we continue to share plain language summaries of results and study communication materials like treatment assignments after the study is completed for review from a patient panel. And we feel that's so important to not just bring them in for a review, but also to share back with them how we made modifications to our studies and what we learned from those engagements, what we were able to adapt, or what we will be considering for future phases. We feel that's just a really important way to continue to give back and recognize their incredible contribution as we design new studies.
Ellen, I think it's such an important point, right? And something I'm not sure is made, or emphasized within the design and review principles, is also the feedback to the individuals that you're working with, right? Sharing with them what was learned from them and how it was applied. I think it's absolutely a matter of good practice to do so. And I do know from the work that you folks do that's an important part of what you do as well.
Definitely. I also think, I know, Thomas, you mentioned about ways to leverage, perhaps, I think you had said templates or any kind of feedback that has already been received. And I was glad you raised that point in your presentation. We don't want to duplicate effort every single time. And I think as Sonia was mentioning, there are times where we'll bring patients in if there's specific questions we may have, but we do try to leverage any kind of market research or literature that's already available that highlights the patient experience or journey prior to engaging with an advisory board. And that also helps us better understand when we're connecting with patients and hearing about their own personal experience, how can we best customize our trials to support that, to support patients like them. Of course, we're not soliciting their participation in the trial itself in the future, but how can we better understand maybe unique experiences or unique challenges and burdens so that we can address those in our study designs.
Yeah, I think that's a great consideration as well, right? And it sort of helps shape a larger point that we want to make here, is that there is not a one size fits all approach in every single trial, right? If you do have prior insights that you've gained, then perhaps you don't need, more in-depth sort of long-standing advisory boards and a lot of, engagement up front to understand the needs of the population. There may be other ways that you can involve them just in the review and development of the materials, right? So, and that's something that I know, Thomas, your organization and SysGroup as well, we help sort of facilitate, taking the right approach at the right time. And something, if I may sort of transition us to one of our points here, one particular document that comes to mind where there's sort of a lot of competing needs, particularly in terms of timelines, is the informed consent document, the participant information, typically how it's referred to in the UK. And, in this case, we do want to involve people enough, which is one of the points here, but what exactly does that mean? And I know, Thomas, you have some thoughts here, particularly on sort of the timing of the document review, some things that go into that. So I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, it's obviously difficult to say when you have involved people enough, right? It's also difficult to put a definite number of, the number of people you need to speak to and who exactly are the right people and so on. But I think using common sense is actually not too bad in this area, because if you need to be able to show that you have involved people enough in the sense that they have provided feedback. And that you have actually used that feedback for something, right? I think also if you think about the right people, also I think we skipped that a little bit. Also, you shouldn't go and ask 3 PhD students that are diabetics about giving feedback. You should actually make the effort of finding representative proportion of population of the patients you're looking for, right? For that particular study, and once I think once you know that you have involved them enough, you have involved them enough. It's that's just how it is. How much would you like to be involved yourself in that case? But you definitely, according to the requirements, need to be able to show that you have actually done something based on patients or the public feedback to your documents, right?
Yeah, and I'd just like to follow up on that point, and I think you're absolutely right. Involving the right group, and when I think of involving the right group, I really think that, and it's something that's evolved, and again, post-COVID, a lot of good things have come out post-COVID. And for me, it's that involvement of diversity, inclusivity, and equity of that patient population. And it's something that we seriously think about, because, you know, there's only a limited number of people that you can involve. But how do we ensure that it's not all PhD students, you know, not just on education levels, but backgrounds of ethnicity, sex distributions, experiences. And I think what else is involved, and I keep going on about this, but it's not just also about the patient, it's also about the people around the patients as well, in terms of being included. And informed consent, you know, we think we write it simply, but the more people that you show it to, the more people have different concepts of what's understandable. And then obviously you can't, it would be ideal if you can tailor an informed consent to every single person so they can understand it, but you need to take a consensus opinion. So you need diversity of thought. Yeah. And I think that's critical.
That's
such
a good point. I'll follow up after your thought.
Yeah, and really it also links into, and that's something that I'm very also passionate about, is ensuring that there's equity in accessibility to the trials. And so this links to that as well. So evolving even from them, and you know, the UK is particularly a very diverse population, and ensuring that translations are appropriate and not, and I remember, you know, as a PI in investigational trials in the past, and the only patients could be involved were the ones that were able to speak English or understand English. And I got all the reasons for that, but actually we shouldn't be excluding people where English isn't their first language. And it's fine when you go to country specifics, but actually within countries, we should also be considering that. And I think that's something that the HRA is also taking very seriously, quite appropriately so. And there's lots of work being done both with the National Institute of Health Research, include projects, and also serving those underserved populations. Over back to you, Ellen.
Such good point, Sonia. I wanted to add to the list that you already shared, that robust list that especially I know you lead in our discussions on who are the right people to engage for some of these more qualitative feedback sessions. Definitely that mix of demographic variables. We also try to identify people who have experience with a clinical trial and also people who do not, so we can also understand what perhaps was a limitation or burdensome to them and what weighed on their in terms of their decision making. And then also, like you said, Sonia, people that have been perhaps diagnosed for a longer period of time, but also people maybe that have been newly diagnosed. We want to hear about what their experience has been like, what their also health experience with the healthcare system has been like. And that's where we try to validate also with different country involvement. If we start, for example, with a US-based group or a different country, and then build off with maybe dyad or triad sessions with 2 or 3 individuals, or individual interviews, depending on culture, whatever is culturally appropriate. So those are a few things that I just wanted to add to that list, that where we're always trying to bring in that diversity. And I'm so glad you brought up the points about accessibility too. I think I have a lot of conversations with our study teams about e-consent as well, and how that should not just be the informed consent in a digital format, but it should also have other ways to engage and make sure that people really fully digest and understand the information.
Yeah, and just to add to your point, Ellen, just sort of thinking about, you know, a lot of the trials that we do are global. I know this is focused on some of those HRA principles, and that would obviously be local within the UK, but how can we make that balance? And so the perspective of somebody from one country may well be different to other, and the healthcare ecosystem is different as well. So how do we ensure that we capture that to ensure that it's still viable in each country and appropriate as well for the individuals?
Yeah, goes back to the topic of involve the right people. right? Because as we've said, and as it describes in the design and review principles, there may be templates, right, that are used. And again, that's something that's quite relevant for informed consent, but there are other documents that may be highly templated, documents that may have had patient review in the past. And so are those individuals who have reviewed those materials representative of, you know, the prospective participant population? And if not, then maybe, yeah, you know, if you're going to the UK newly, or if you're focusing on a disease or therapeutic area where there is greater diversity than maybe what you previously had gained insight from, then yeah, it is reasonable to say you need to do a little bit more there. And so, you know, part of the reason why we bring up the consideration of informed consent is timelines, right? And you know, it's not necessarily something that I'm going to request comment on. You folks are more than happy to jump on it, but I will say that I know that there are some folks who are willing to sort of push back their ethics submission in order to ensure that they do achieve that representation. There are instances where we've seen that happen, and I think it is absolutely the right thing to do. In fact, in all the discussions that we have in terms of greater diversity in clinical research, we always sort of start with, you should start early and you should understand that this is going to take a little bit more time to achieve that. Certainly until particularly, you know, you have really established standards and practices within organizations and, you know, within industry in general. So again, happy to have comment from either Ellen or Sonia on that, or Thomas, but it's just a point that I wanted to you know, make sure that we're thinking about.
I think I can provide a small comment here. You know, I have background in clinical operations in the industry, and certainly have felt the pressure of timelines many times. And it always seems to be kind of a stressful period when you're developing the protocol and getting ready for submissions, and it's very difficult with the informed consent because you have to co-develop it with the protocol itself. So you cannot have a completely nice and shiny and complete informed consent if you have only half a protocol, because yeah, it doesn't work that way. So it's quite interesting how to you know, actually try to accomplish this without having too many delays. And I think that would be worth yeah, a discussion in itself maybe at one point, but it's certainly very I would say would be very good if you had your template looked upon and evaluated, and then by the public or patients, and then you could insert the last couple of details at the end, and then maybe have that looked on as well, and then you would be more or less set. But it's a dilemma how to get this done in a short time without delays. But or you could just accept the delays and live with that.
I just wanted to add to Thomas's comments. I think we've been finding to be very helpful has been having a template that has been reviewed by patients, so that we can mitigate any risk of delay. But then when we bring in an advisory board around the time of study concept or outline development, then we have the opportunity to customize some of the language specific to the feedback we're receiving. And that's helped, I think, many of our operational teams to avoid those kinds of delays that could be tied to informed consent or protocol.
Yeah, good point.
But I know that's always a concern. But any kind of planning we can do at those stages, or even revamping the template over these past couple of years, has been really helpful.
You know, so one consideration, I'll just take that template point a little bit further, particularly when it comes to informed consent. There is definitely going to be some sections that are templated, you know, across studies, but then there may be some sections that are not, right? And I think there are still ways to establish language beforehand, something you might call a glossary, right? That can be ongoing work that's done prior to the point of having a protocol developed, so that now you are under the pressure, right? So I think that's something that folks can also consider, sort of extend that concept of template to glossary language. You can plan for that and you can establish that. And on the prior planning point, again, we can't say enough about it, right? Ensuring that study teams and overall, management operations of research are informed about these issues, or not issues, but these good practices that should be done. Not everybody has individuals like Ellen, within their organization who are there to help guide study teams in doing this. And so I think that is potentially a small challenge, but again, sort of why we're doing this type of thing is so folks can have those learnings and hopefully take that back.
Thank you, Beta. But
sorry,
go ahead, Sonia.
I mean, following up on that, it's as well as template making everything as succinct as possible, also ensuring the roadmap of when are we going to do it. Don't do it too late, and factor in the time points of the first draft, the reviews by various personals and various functions, not least the patients and carers, and they should maybe be earlier rather than later, and then allowing for time to adapt, to change, and saying, okay, well, we may have this date, but what you don't want is to put it in and then come back and have lots of changes made, having to go and see more patients, because actually that can delay even more than just maybe a couple of weeks where you really focus on getting it right. So again, back to the right, get it right first time, or as close to right before submission.
I'm so grateful that you're such a champion for that too, Sonia, and I know that you've been really guided other study teams also in making sure that this is happening much earlier. And that also applies in ways that we're trying to measure study performance too. And if we're able to or if we're able to get it right much earlier on, then we can hopefully avoid study amendments in the future that could have been tied to if we have gotten feedback related to our protocol earlier that maybe was related to eligibility criteria or particular burdens that we can address much earlier on in the process. So thank you to Sonia for also really advocating for this early in planning.
So we have, unfortunately, our colleagues, Becky and Amanda, were not able to join us. We're looking forward to their direct experience. I will say, if folks have them in their network, they do have direct experience here that they were going to share. And so, they are great resources as well. So not in this webinar, but perhaps, we may bring them back, but also, seek those folks out. Because I think that they can provide a lot of helpful insight from their, firsthand knowledge. But having said that, we have a number of great questions submitted. And I think just the first one that I wanted to start with, though, is sort of the most burning question, or perhaps, what some folks may characterize as the bottom line, which is, that language around receiving favorable opinion. And so, do we think, or do we know of instances where, a research ethics committee will request or may request that, additional patient involvement needs to be had? And so I'll open the floor. I don't, but probably first I'm going to pass it over to you, Thomas, because I know you have some insights here that you gained from speaking with some folks.
Yeah, that's true. I think the short answer is yes, there will be people out there, companies out there receiving a non-favorable opinion. They may have, possibly they would have received that also before this was put into place, because it's been an expectation that you live up to these things for a while, right? But just not in a formalized way. But yes, I do know from personal contact with people in the industry that they have been surprised and had their submission rejected, and then they needed to go out and speak with some patients, and that obviously that put a lot of delay. You know the system and how it works. Probably you don't do that overnight and resubmit and get a new answer the next week on approval. So it takes a lot of time. So again, back to the point that was made earlier, really try to get it right the first time. That's very, very important. It's well invested 2 weeks or whatever it takes to get this done. And also, you know, I have the pleasure of working with people that are actually reviewers in ethics committees in the UK, and they also say yes, you know, applications will be rejected, but they will, if it's a case of delaying very important treatment to children or another vulnerable population or something like that, it is not going to, you know, stand in the way of that. So then you will probably just get a remark, you know, that you should have done this, but in the interest of time, you know, we move on. But next time, you know, you better remember to involve the patients. So that's what I've heard on that specific point.
Ellen or Sonia, did you want to share any perspective there? If not, we do have a number of questions that we can get to. Okay. Yeah, and so maybe I'll just you know, cap that off by, you know, of course we know from global experience, whether in the US or in the UK or in the EU, that different ethics committees, research ethics committees or IRBs may have differing perspectives and approaches and applications of what may be called, you know, regulatory requirement or regulatory language or even regulatory guidelines. So there is always going to be variability there. You know, I sort of maybe wanted to avoid the term risk, but I think the idea here, as you folks have said, if you do this and you do it well, not as a checkbox activity, then you reasonably, from my perspective, a pragmatic individual, you have then, you know, sort of met the overall standard that is being looked for here. This may be, you know, more geared towards those research organizations or academic researchers who sort of don't do this at all, right? And again, we've heard, Sonia, you've mentioned this, and others have said it here as well. This is an expectation that has been around for a while, and now it's sort of, you know, formalization. It's here in black and white writing. There's no way around this anymore. All right. So as I said, a number of really great questions here. Some of these are, you know, probably easier and quicker to get to. So first question, would there be the same expectations for non-interventional studies? I don't know, Thomas, if from the language that's there, would your expectation be that? I mean, the HRA is the human research right authority, and so even if it's not interventional, that would presumably fall under.
I definitely think so. I've trolled through the the information quite a bit, and it doesn't mention that at all or make any distinguish. Yeah, it doesn't imply that. So I think it would be yeah, applicable for non-interventional studies as well. I would go as far as to say that I would bet on it. So yeah.
And maybe a point to make here as well, from what I've heard from a number of different colleagues and also, you know, attending webinars and being in panel or listening into panel discussions, the HRA, but also research ethics committees in the UK are very open to discussion. They're very open to you approaching them, you know, prior to your submission and sort of understanding what the requirements are and getting their sort of, let's say, barometer on whether, you know, you are following what may be expected. So I think that's something that should be mentioned here is I don't think there is sort of a firewall where you cannot, you know, have some more insight before you jump into a submission. We also, this is perhaps a little bit more of a comment, but it follows on a point that Thomas, you and I talked about, and that's that in your survey, individuals indicated that maybe they don't, you know, compensation isn't the most important thing to them, and they would potentially do be involved in the development of materials or providing insights even without compensation. But I don't think in any way you're sort of advocating for not compensating individuals fairly. And I'll just let you respond to that.
No, you're completely right. I think you are. It's expected that you pay them a fair price for the time they spend. So it's not an area that I, to be honest, know very much about. But I do know that you should, try to hit that sweet spot where you don't pay too much and not too little. Yeah.
And I mean, actually, following up on that, there are guidance and standards, and particularly now again, the NIHR have actually set fair market values for people to be compensated for their time. And it's absolutely right that people do.
Yep. We work with our internal compliance team to provide us with the resources to make sure that we're providing with the correct fair market value.
Absolutely. So from a colleague that I know well, at which point in time do you recommend conducting patient review? I think we've touched on this, multiple different times. And again, it's sort of based on your current knowledge base. If you have sort of not enough insight, then you should early, before maybe at the time you have a draft protocol, but even prior to that, establish relationships, have a standing advisory board, get insights in general on patients' experiences, their diagnosis journey, and then, of course, some aspects of the trial, and then subsequently involve them in the development of the materials. So basically, we heard you, here's what we've done. What do you think? Did we hit the mark? If not, we'd love to, have your feedback again to help improve that. But I'll open the floor if anybody else wants to also respond to that.
Completely agree with you, Betosh. And I was just going to add that when we do bring them in earlier for not just review of material, but to understand disease experience, that's also been a great time for us to start making inroads or building relationships with patient organizations on a global scale. So that's been very helpful because I know, and I saw there was one question coming up, which we can address shortly, but related to how do you find the right individuals? How do you find patients to represent these populations? And so I think bringing in patient organizations has also been really a helpful step for us.
Absolutely. So a question about translations. How do you manage them if they are translated appropriately? Especially keeping in mind that we don't want to lose all the work done on the master English version of the template concerning lay terminology. And actually, while we were on this webinar, I went and I looked really quickly. I'm not sure the translations are mentioned in the point of, or within the points of patient involvement, but it does in the points of use plain language say your translations should also be in plain language. So I'll just mention that, and then does anyone have some thoughts?
I'm happy to share our process. I completely agree that we need to make sure that they're in plain language as well. I think a lot of that is when we work with a vendor like Syscript, for example. I know that there's that emphasis on bringing in the with translations that you have the plain language principles that are followed. So either we will work with a vendor to translate the English version we might have to start, or we'll work with our own a different translation vendor. But we always have in-country leads to review or affiliates to be able to review that the material is appropriate and culturally sensitive. And then after that, we try to bring in patient advisors that we may have engaged with already to take a look at that content that's now been developed based off of their feedback and also translated into their native language. So that's just a general kind of process that we follow. I think a lot of it really, you need to make sure that you have alignment with the vendors you're working with.
Absolutely. Again, you could have an entire webinar series on translation. So we have a comment from an individual, and I'm actually going to call out the name here, Paula Rogers, who says it's likely to be a provisional opinion pending PPI, which is patient public involvement, rather than unfavorable opinion with full resubmission. So, I think it's helpful to have that insight as well. Obviously, it's going to be a case-by-case basis, but I do think that is, in case sort of we may have accidentally implied that it would be straight up, rejected. That's not necessarily the case. It'll be case by case basis. Probably a question that we sort of have touched on, but there is a question directed specifically towards you, Sonia. How to find the right group. They should be patient reps, not chosen by the investigators. For example, going through patient association. So you folks did just talk about that, but I just wanted, if you wanted to add to it.
Yeah, and so again, it's about sort of opening it up to the wider community and public patients. And patient organizations are a great resource. And the thing about them is that, the groups and the people who are affiliated with these groups have deep insights both into the disease, but also the opportunities of clinical trials and understanding clinical trials. Now, there are groups, and particularly in the UK, that have actually developed to develop education systems, because you can know about your disease, and the best person to know about their disease is the person suddenly with the disease and their family carers. But how many people know about clinical research and clinical trials, the relevance of that? So to be able to know both is really the sweet spot and what's really important. Patient organizations do a great job at helping to educate on what clinical trials are. But there are diseases, and particularly some of the rarer diseases that we work on, where the reach is not so large. There may not be UK specific organizations, they may be international organizations. So how do we reach those patients? We've tried a variety of methods. And again, we've worked very well and successfully with SysScript on trying to identify some of those patients. And, beyond patient organizations, links with potentially social media, with connections. So building ground up from a brand new indication can be tough. It's not impossible, but it's harder, and especially when it's rare. And on top of that, one of the things, and again, it's that sort of diversity, inclusion, equity, is that when we look to forming our patient advisory boards, we also look specifically, have they had the condition, have they had these experiences, but also have they had any experience in clinical trials? And it may be that we help educate them to understand what clinical research is about, so that then they can give informed instruction and advice to us, both about the disease, but also about how to conduct the trial. And what's required on the informed consent.
Great points.
So we have 6 minutes left, but there's another question here, actually a couple of questions, and it's about involvement for pediatric or adolescent studies. And so one question is, would the approach be different there? And then another question that's related is, would it be expected to include pediatric patients for review of assents? So that second question, pediatric patients for review of assents, I mean, it's very specific, again, based on what we're seeing in the guidance that has been put out, I would say yes, but I'll just mention one way that we do that, and then I'll open up the floor, because I know that folks here have experience with that as well. It's the parents or guardians is who you sort of work through, and you do ask them if it's appropriate, if you are comfortable, would you please review this with your child or the individual that you have guardianship over. And then we have even gone to interviews where both of those individuals, right, parent or guardian and child or individual who they have guardianship over, are in the interview. So that is an approach that we have taken, but I wanted to be as brief there as I could. Do you folks have thoughts on this as well?
I mean, I'm quite passionate about it. We shouldn't be ageist about it. We call them pediatrics. We call them, and talk about the ages, in the old days, we used to have clinical trials that used to limit at a certain age of 75. Everybody needs to have access to clinical trials if appropriate and safe. So, again, Patash, I agree with you. The process needs to be a little bit more controlled in the pediatric population. The adolescents is also a little bit blurry as well, and the guidelines may well vary from country to country, what we classify as adult and pediatric and the bit in between. So parents, guardians will always be needed, but they shouldn't just be the speaker. Ultimately, it's the patient, and no matter what their age, they need to have some thoughts and opinions. And be able to share that in a safe environment. I mean, I do recall, and this is going back sort of 20, 30 years, I think diabetes was one of the first diseases to really go for that. And they used to really bring together, because controlling particularly adolescent diabetes used to be very difficult. So how could they further research, not just for clinical trials, but improve care? And they used to have these camps where the adolescents would come together and talk about it, again, facilitated by healthcare professionals. And so, yeah, they need to be involved. The regulations need to be a little bit tighter in terms of the consent to be involved as part of the patient ambassadors. And here you do need to include the parents. It will be interesting how time evolves. You know, the 16, 17, 18-year-old, do their parents need? So, and actually, I do recall an occasion when I was a PR on an investigation where there was, where a person who was actually 18, however, there were some mental challenges. This person was very high functioning, very bright, who wanted to partake in a trial, whilst the parents were not so sure because they were. And so, yeah, there can be challenges, but listening to the voice of everyone and the neurodiversity is going to be important. So being sensitive to that, but allowing for it and not excluding it.
Yep. And just to add to Sonia and the points you raised, Betash, around the approach, which is similar to what we are taking, we always make sure that the materials that we'll be sharing, the moderator guide, any kind of patient-facing stimuli, is reviewed by an ethics committee as well. So that's yet another kind of control that we have to make sure when we engage with a more vulnerable population in these qualitative sessions.
And actually, one thing I'm sort of thinking about is particularly informed consent. It needs to be easily understood. And if anything, if a younger person who hasn't had as much education can understand it, that makes for a very good informed consent form. And if it can only be understood by a person with, you know, higher degree and postdoc experience, then there's something wrong. So if anything, if you can test it on your 8-year-old and they understand it, that's a good consent form.
Completely agree, Sonia. I think that's a very, very good point. We overestimate the ability to understand informed consent form quite a lot. So I think that's a very good point. You should have your kid read it, and if they understand, it's good.
Exactly.
Absolutely, absolutely.
With their consent, of course.
Yeah.
To read it.
So a couple of really quick questions that I missed, and I just want to sort of give a quick response to, and then we can all have an opportunity to just share some closing thoughts here. One was, when did or do these standards go into effect for upcoming IRAS submissions? So the principles and quality standards were published prior to December 1st, but it said starting from December 1st, essentially, these things will be in practice. But as we've said here, these are sort of expectations that were out there, just not necessarily, you know, detailed or outlined in the way that they are now. So that was one question. Another
one
question.
point,
Yes, please.
it's December 2023, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
December of last year. Yes, this past
Yes,
December,
so.
not this upcoming December. That's right.
Yep.
Another question that we had, comment and question. This is a brilliant step by the HRA, much needed. This is from Trishna, a good colleague. Do you think counterpart bodies in other countries will follow? If you ask me, the wave of patient involvement, patient engagement, patient centricity is here and overtaking. And you also know that there are sort of pieces of this, you know, by different regulatory bodies. And of course, also the overall guidelines, was it the IHS? I forget what it is. Yes, that's right. They also have a point in their general considerations for conduct of trials about patient involvement. So I think that's particularly on protocol development, but still, point is, you know, there are pieces of this already existing, maybe not to the breadth that the NHS is asking for here, but eventually, yes. Let's put it that way, from my perspective. person.
I actually, Natasha, actually, I had the same question. So I actually called the Danish ethics committee and asked them about it. And they said, very good point. We have noticed that this is happening in the UK. And I asked them, so when will this happen in the rest of Europe? And they said, we would love it to happen now, but we have to wait until it comes from a central place. And they said that will not be half a year or a year. It will probably be a longer. But it is coming. That's what they said. They guarantee that it's coming with the next updates, so to speak, because it is very important and in the forefront of everyone's mind. Yeah.
Absolutely. So there were a couple of other questions. I just want to apologize to folks. You've submitted wonderful questions. And if any we did not get to, please feel free to reach out to us and we will, be happy to sort of share our thoughts after. But in the way of respecting everybody's time here, just quick thoughts from me is that I think this is just sort of following on the same discussion point. This is another example of the greater implementation, standardization of patient engagement good practices, patient involvement in particular. I think that everybody should be doing this, but understand that it is not necessarily easy. It does take change management. It does take some, awareness and training of all staff that are involved. And it also takes, knowing what the good practices and standards are. And just a little bit of a plug that there are guidances out there, PFMD, UPADI, many others that can be named, and then organizations as well that and individuals who are experts in this area, either those who can provide services for you or those that are sort of open to just providing helpful guidance. So that's my spiel, and I will pass it over to whomever would like to share their closing thoughts next.
I can give it a quick go. I think it's been very, very interesting to hear this, be part of this, and to hear everyone's perspective. And there are so many unanswered questions still, and so much work to do. And there's, I think we're heading in the right direction, though. So that's good.
I just want to follow up on that, saying, thank you for organising this webinar, and whilst you've had experience in patient-centric design, you always learn more things when you have people coming together and asking questions. And we really could be a force of change for the whole world. It started in the UK, but let's keep this going and the conversations open and really showing how we make impact to the public at large.
Agreed. Thank you all so much. It was great having this conversation with you today, and we're keeping track of the questions that have come through too, in case there are any we could address. Maybe we could do a recap article or something, Betosh, to highlight some of these other wonderful points that have been raised. Thank you all so much for attending, and it's been a really interesting discussion. Excited to see this movement.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to our speakers. I imagine a round of applause from the attendees right now. And yes, the conversation moves forward. Perhaps you will see us again doing something like this in some forum. And we again welcome the contributions of folks who are in the audience and in general. Collaboration is key here for us to do what's right by patients. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.